Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Ozark Mountains. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1863, a year already stained with smoke and grief. Yet far from the great battle lines, deep in the folds of the Ozark Mountains, another kind of silence ruled. Here the wind could scrape across limestone ridges for hours without a single voice to answer it. Pines creaked like old timbers of a sunken ship, and the narrow valleys filled with mist until dawn. It was there that Sheriff Elias Harding began keeping a private journal, one that local archivists would later call the most troubling record ever filed in the county's custody. At that time, the Civil War raged only a few counties north. Shelby's raid, a Confederate cavalry incursion under the restless Colonel Joseph Shelby, had torn across Missouri and Arkansas earlier that year, scattering frightened settlers and deserters alike through the Ozark wilderness. Harding's first entries mention strangers from the war, ragged, half-mad, trading relics for bread. Most sheriffs were busy conscripting men or collecting taxes. Harding, by contrast, spent nights alone riding between hollows, checking on families who had stopped appearing at market. He had served as deputy before the war. A mild man, literate, punctual. Witnesses later recalled that he spoke as if he were reading from a Bible, even when angry. But beginning that March, his notes shifted from routine entries, taxes, trespassing, petty theft, to unease. March 12th. Reports of light near Cedar Branch. Woman's cry? Could be echo. March 15th. Old Kate saw footprints like a child's leading into Shale Ravine, none returning. March 19th. Need to verify. Cedar Branch was a desolate strip of creek, twisting between steep limestone walls. Only two families remained there by 63, the Bracketts and the Cranstons. The Bracketts were quiet folk: John, his wife Sarah, and two children, Lydia and Tom. Harding's later depositions describe them as kind, devout, yet overly watchful of strangers. The Cranstons, by contrast, were wanderers, tenant farmers who'd lived in 3 counties in 5 years. According to one storekeeper, they never stayed till harvest and always left a window boarded. Harding's journal suggests that what drew his attention was not the people, but the pattern. Travelers through the hollow had begun disappearing. First a trapper named Mercer, then a peddler called Caleb Dunn. Both were last seen near the Brackett property. Harding rode there twice in late March and found nothing unusual except, as he wrote, a stillness I did not trust. One entry stands apart, written across 2 pages in uneven ink. April 2nd. Returned from Cedar Branch, water low. Saw small rag at spring's lip torn from child's garment. Woman Brackett denies knowledge, air thick as cellar. It was this note that future historians would circle again and again, not for what it said, but for what followed. The next entry came 4 days later, and it read only, April 6th, Deputy Givens missing. When the April rain lifted, the sheriff's office in Gainesville received a note from a freight driver out of Norwood. It said only that a horse was found grazing alone on the Cedar Branch Road. Saddle still warm, reins torn. Sheriff Harding rode out that same afternoon with 2 men, Constable Lottie Reynolds and Reverend Cyrus Melville, who often accompanied such searches to temper the nerves, as he put it. They followed the narrow track through dripping woods until dusk. The horse was indeed there. Deputy Amos Givens's chestnut mare, trembling and mud-caked, her left flank streaked with dried blood that wasn't hers. Harding led her home and penned a formal notice. Deputy presumed missing, foul play uncertain. That line, later filed with the county clerk, was the last official record before the war years swallowed all attention. But Harding's personal journal continued. His next pages show a tone shifting from procedure to obsession. April 9th. At Cedar Branch again, silence heavy, found marks of dragging by creek. 3 toes distinct, barefoot, soil soft, as if newly turned. April 10th. Returned alone. Creek water low, reflecting light though no sun visible. Heard sound, child or bird. He began recording more than law. Margins filled with weather notes, sketches of trees, small diagrams of the creek bed. It's clear he was mapping something he could not name. Locals at the time believed the Brackett cabin abandoned. After John Brackett's disappearance in late March, his wife and children were said to have left for her kin in Taney County. Yet when Harding questioned travelers, several claimed to see smoke without fire in the hollow, or to hear a door creaking after midnight. A woodcutter named Samuel Crow testified decades later that the sheriff took to lighting his lantern thrice each night and sitting by the window as if waiting for orders from the dark. One knee out from May 1st reads, "Left coin and Bible at spring, will return after full moon." Then a line beneath, she spoke again. The water moved upward. No one knew what he meant. Some thought the stress of the war had broken his reason. Others remembered that Shelby's raid had passed near those same woods not months before, scattering cavalrymen and deserters who hid in caves and sinkholes for shelter. Harding's insistence that someone, or something, was living beneath the Brackett Hollow might have been his way of naming the unnameable chaos around him. Yet the details are too precise to dismiss. A month later, another entry. June 5. Dug 2 feet by cedar root. Found linen scrap, bone the length of thumb, not animal. Buried again. After that, the handwriting grows rough. Phrases trail off. Heard whisper, 2 figures, one bent, must speak to Reverend. And then abruptly, Reynolds refuses to return to Hollow. I will go alone. Constable Reynolds later confirmed that she refused. In her 1870 affidavit, she wrote, I heard noises under the ground like the tapping of picks, though the sheriff was the only man present above it. The last entry from that summer ends mid-sentence. Lantern dropped, voices nearer, soil moving, and then nothing. The next pages are blank except for a dark smear across the binding, water, ink, or something else. Autumn of 1863 came early to the Ozarks that year, and with it, the silence deepened. The war had moved northward, and the hills were left to their own strange peace. Sheriff Harding's absence went largely unnoticed at first. Men went missing often in those days, either to the army or the wilderness. It was Constable Reynolds who finally entered his cabin after 9 days without word. What she found there became the foundation of what historians later called the Harding Journal case. Inside, the air was heavy with mildew and old oil smoke. The lamp was cold, the chair overturned, but nothing stolen. On the table lay the sheriff's ledger, open to a single note written in a jagged hand. No sound above ground tonight. Beneath it in pencil, smaller letters, they are finished waiting. Reynolds also found soil scattered across the plank floor, and, curiously, a cedar branch pressed flat beneath a heavy iron key. She gathered both and brought them to Reverend Melville, who by then kept the church records for safekeeping. In his later testimony, he wrote, there was an odor of wet stone about it, and the faintest hum, like a jar of flies sealed in wax. Search parties went out twice in October, once following the creek, once combing the ridge trail, but neither found a trace of the sheriff. Only a small clearing with freshly disturbed soil was noted near the Brackett property. The men filled it again, saying, "No reason to trouble the dead without proof." When snow fell that winter, the case seemed forgotten. Yet in 1864, a wandering Union courier stopped at the county seat bearing a requisition letter stamped Brigade Command, Missouri. He reported seeing a derelict cabin burned out near Little Cedar Branch, unmistakably recent, though long deserted. He also mentioned tracks of horses nearby, their shoes mismatched, some bearing the pattern typical of the cavalry in Volos, viewed in Shelby's raid months earlier. The courier assumed deserters had used the ruins for cover, but among the ashes, he claimed, lay a chain of 3 keys fused by heat and a half-burned book written throughout in one man's hand. Reverend Melville believed this must have been Harding's ledger, thought lost. Yet fragments of another copy, possibly a personal duplicate, were later found among court archives sealed in 1875. These fragments bore faint entries dated months after the sheriff's presumed disappearance. One page reads, "Cold again, no moonlight. Heard the tapping once more, below the cedar. I do not fear it now." The handwriting is steady but foreign to Harding's earlier script, too straight, too deliberate, as though someone mimicked his hand. Ink analysis done decades later revealed traces of soot and lampblack, not the blue-black ink he used before. Another fragment adds, "The brackets are beneath. They built as told. Earth remembers." To this day, no one can explain who wrote those final lines or how they surfaced 12 years after his death certificate was filed. The fragments were found folded within a courthouse wall during repairs, dry and untouched by time. It was then that locals began calling the place the Hollow That Writes. Even today, some say that on cold nights the creek murmurs in the rhythm of a pen scratching paper, a sound too steady, too human to be water. By 1866, the war had ended and the counties were rebuilding, though the Ozarks recovered slower than most. Crops failed, roads washed out, and law offices lay empty. Yet the story of Sheriff Harding never settled. New sheriffs came and went, but his ledger, rescued from the courthouse wall, remained in the clerk's custody, wrapped in oilcloth and marked private evidence. Around that time, a surveyor named Ephraim Lowe came through the region, hired to re-establish property lines for land grants issued to returning soldiers. His diary, preserved today at the Missouri Historical Society, contains one line that would later resurface in discussions of the Harding case. "Old cedar stump by the hollow, ringed with iron nails. Ground beneath gives hollow sound when struck." Lowe's team tried to dig, but the soil was oddly packed, as if tamped by years of deliberate pressure. Beneath the cedar roots, they unearthed several small objects: a rusted key, fragments of cloth, and a bent spoon engraved with the initials S.B. He noted the finds, then reburied them, remarking, "Locals say cursed. Best leave as found." That same winter, Reverend Melville received a parcel with no return mark. Inside, 3 pages of old paper, brittle, written in Harding's script. Only one page bore words that could be read in full. "If they rise, close the hollow again. They need the dark." The Reverend locked the papers in his vestry drawer. When he died, the drawer was empty. By 1870, the Brackett homestead was little more than a depression in the ground. Only a few charred logs remained, and the spring that had once fed the creek had dried into a narrow fissure. Yet several accounts from travelers mention hearing faint hammering sounds at night, as though someone were working metal underground. One drifter described it as the tapping of coffins, not shovels. Mrs. Cates, the trapper's widow who had lived near the site, later testified before the district court. "When the moon sits low and the mist creeps, I hear him reading. The sheriff, I know his voice. I was a girl when he passed, but I know it still. The clerk marked her statement as delirious testimony, but locals whispered otherwise. Children avoided the hollow. Farmers rerouted their fences to avoid the spring. One night in 1871, a fire spread through the courthouse attic, destroying half the old archives, including the earliest pages of Harding's original ledger. Only the final section survived, the one written in the darker ink. It is that surviving portion that scholars believe was not penned by Harding himself. The script resembles his hand, but bears none of his hesitations. Every line flows with eerie precision. The last entry reads, "The soil is full of memory. We only borrowed its silence." A later annotation by an unknown clerk appears beneath it in red pencil. "Do not open the cedar mound again." For years afterward, whenever new deputies took office, the townsfolk would tell them, "Never patrol the hollow alone, and never under any condition dig near that stump." Most laughed it off until the spring thaw of 1875, when the creek swelled again and revealed what lay buried beneath the roots. The flood of 1875 was remembered less for its destruction and more for what it uncovered. Heavy rains lashed the Ozark Hills through March, sending torrents of water down gullies that hadn't run in decades. When it reached the Cedar Branch Hollow, the old mound by the cedar stump split open, the earth sloughing away in thick black sheets. Children from a nearby settlement first saw it. They were gathering driftwood when one of them spotted something pale jutting from the mud, a hand-sized object like a doll's head. By the time adults arrived, the mound had half collapsed. Beneath the tangled roots lay what appeared to be a wooden shaft, descending into darkness. The opening was narrow but smooth, as if reinforced. Inside, men found fragments of planks, rope, and, deeper still, rusted metal hinges. Sheriff Corwin Finch, Harding's successor, filed a report that survives in the county archives. Found subterranean space under Cedar Branch Mound. Approx. 4 feet in width, descending at angle toward the creek. Air within stagnant. Recovered 1 key, iron, 1 broken lamp, and what appears a journal fragment. That fragment, smeared and incomplete, contained only a few legible words. Returned again. Voices softer now, water closing. Finch sealed the tunnel with loose stone and earth, marking it with a wooden cross. But 3 days later, the barrier had sunk nearly a foot, as though the soil beneath had shifted. When he ordered it refilled, the men refused. One, a veteran named Darnell, said the ground felt like it was breathing. A young teacher, Miss Evelyn McCready, then new to the area, recorded the event in her letters. They say the sheriff himself came up through the mud, though not as we remember him. When the light struck the hole, something in there moved, not a man, but not beast either. The ground gave way, and they left it to bury itself. Of course, her account is colored by rumor. Yet McCready's later writings, kept now in the state archives, show she remained convinced the site was more than a collapsed root cellar. The shape of the chamber, she noted, was deliberate, not natural. It was dug with purpose. After the flood receded, Finch rode to Springfield to consult old military engineers, suspecting the cavity could be a forgotten dugout or munitions cache left from the days of Shelby's raid, 1863. One captain recalled deserters using such pits as hidden depots, but found it odd that this one lay far from any known supply routes. If it were a cache, he wrote, someone meant to keep it secret, even from his own men. When Finch returned, the hollow had changed again. The creek, diverted by the flood, now ran directly through the mound. Locals swore the water there ran colder than elsewhere, clear by day, black by night. A fisherman who dipped his net in that stretch found it torn, as if by stone teeth. The sheriff closed the site with a notice nailed to a cedar post. Caution, unstable ground, trespass by penalty of law. It didn't matter. No one went near it, not for another generation. Yet the ledger, the one they'd found under the courthouse wall, would not rest either. For in 1881, a new clerk sorting old property deeds found fresh ink stains on its last page, though no one had opened it in years. The clerk's name was Samuel Withrow, a mild man known for his precision. He had handled countless ledgers over his career, yet when he opened the old Harding journal, he said later that the pages felt damp, as if they had just been written. The ink on the final entry, "We only borrowed its silence," was darker than the rest, still faintly glossy under the lamplight. Thinking it a trick of moisture, he left it open overnight to dry. By morning, something had changed. The final page now bore a faint addition, a single new line. "You have opened it again." Withrow swore no one else had been in the room. He locked the ledger in a tin box and carried it to Sheriff Finch. The sheriff, already tired of ghost stories, dismissed it as a prank by one of the clerks. But when he lifted the book himself, he remarked that the binding was cold, like river stone. He ordered it sealed once more and stored in the courthouse cellar, where humidity and silence might dull whatever imagination haunted it. Weeks later, the courthouse watchman resigned abruptly, claiming he heard writing in the basement after midnight. His replacement, a widower named Clark, found faint mud prints leading up the cellar stairs, though there'd been no rain in weeks. Clark stayed only 3 nights. Meanwhile, life in the Ozarks moved on. The railroad reached as far as Springfield, and new settlers came from the east. Yet the old families still spoke quietly of the hollow that writes. Travelers who passed near Cedar Branch told of strange murmurs from the ground, rhythmic and steady, like a man reciting names. Children dared one another to throw stones into the fissure. Sometimes the stones never made a sound at all. In the autumn of 1883, Reverend Melville's successor, Pastor Allen Reese, began collecting testimonies for a church chronicle. He interviewed Mrs. Cates, by then frail, near 90, who told him, "The soil remembers his footsteps. Sheriff Harding walks yet, but he don't need air now." Pastor Reese dismissed it as senile talk, but his notes include a peculiar addendum. Visited the site, found old iron cross toppled, beneath it, earth hollow to the touch. Heard sound, knocking, soft, deliberate. He left the area shortly thereafter. Curiosity grew again when a local historian, Professor Edwin Lathrop, arrived from St. Louis in 1886. Lathrop specialized in Civil War field records and hoped to verify whether deserters from Shelby's raid had once used the Ozark caves as hideouts. Upon hearing the villagers' warnings, he naturally sought the hollow first. In his letter to the Missouri Historical Society, he described finding a depression like a well, lined with rotted timber, and claimed he could still smell burnt oil and cedar. He took sketches, but none survive. Lathrop's tent was found 2 days later, empty, but undisturbed. His mule was tethered nearby, and his journal, ironically, was open to a blank page, marked only by a muddy thumbprint. After his disappearance, local papers ran small notices under the heading, "Missing Historian in Ozarks." The editor of the Springfield Republican remarked dryly that the hills seem eager to reclaim their own. By winter's first frost, the story had quieted again. The creek froze over, and the cedar stump was buried in snow. Yet those who lived nearest claimed to see footprints circling it, bare, human, and fresh, long after any living man had reason to walk there. By 1888, the county of Ozark had changed its borders, its old towns renamed or absorbed, yet the hollow by Cedar Branch remained unmapped. Travelers who came through the region sometimes drew it as a void. an unmarked patch of white surrounded by contour lines. Surveyors avoided it altogether, noting their instruments behaved strangely near its edge. Compass needles spun, and ink froze inside their pens, even in warm weather. That summer, the courthouse in Gainesville underwent repairs. When laborers cleared the cellar, they came upon the tin box that once held Harding's ledger. The lock had rusted through, and moisture had warped the hinges. The foreman, a man named Jonas Keene, opened it in daylight, expecting mold and paper pulp. Instead, he found the journal intact and strangely preserved, its pages crisp, its cover firm as if new. Keene's written statement, later filed with the county clerk, includes a detail often overlooked. The first page was blank but damp to touch. When I wiped my hand, it left a black stain that did not fade. The journal was turned over to the new sheriff, Thomas Ridley, who placed it in a glass cabinet as a curiosity. By then, the story of Sheriff Harding had become more legend than record, told around fires to frighten children. But Ridley, proud of his post-war rationalism, made it a point to disprove superstition. He invited townsfolk to see the haunted journal for themselves. Over a dozen people signed a guest register noting they'd touched the glass and felt nothing unusual. The matter might have ended there, had the courthouse not burned again that September. This fire began in the records room, precisely where the cabinet stood. Though the blaze consumed every ledger and map, one object was recovered from the ashes, the metal spine of Harding's journal, bent but unblackened. Inside its binding, preserved by the warped glass, was a single page that had resisted the flames. The ink was faint yet legible, written in that same unnatural hand. We remain where the ground remembers. Witnesses said the sheriff was shaken. One clerk described him staring into the ruins until dawn, muttering, "It wrote itself again." He left town a week later and never returned. In the years that followed, the hollow became a local taboo. Farmers fenced it off. The cedar stump was swallowed by new growth. Only hunters ventured near, and they spoke of hearing slow knocks from beneath their boots. One described it as someone asking to come up. Another swore he heard a man whisper his name, though no one else was there. In 1892, a group of miners exploring limestone veins nearby rediscovered the fissure. They lowered a lamp, tied by rope, into the darkness. When it reached a certain depth, the light dimmed and began to sway, though no draft was felt above. One man claimed he heard a voice reciting something like a ledger roll, dates, names, locations. He cut the rope and left it there. The others mocked him until they smelled smoke rising from the hole, smoke that carried the scent of cedar and ink. By the turn of the century, even the boldest locals avoided the place. Those who moved into the county were told, as polite advice, if you hear writing at night, go back inside. And still, some evenings, a faint glow was seen where the cedar once stood, steady and amber, like the flame of a lamp held patiently underground. The dawn of the new century brought railroads, telegraphs, and an air of progress, even to the quiet folds of the Ozarks. But around the hollow, time seemed unmoved. The cedar had long since rotted away, yet locals said new shoots never grew from its roots. Cattle avoided the patch, and birds circled wide overhead. Those who had inherited land near Cedar Branch petitioned the county to rezone it. No one wanted to claim title over a place that, in their words, never stayed buried. In 1901, a geologist from the University of Missouri named Dr. Robert Melton arrived to survey mineral deposits. His assistant later recounted that Melton was skeptical of the folklore, but curious about the unusual topography. "The hollow," he wrote, "is neither natural sinkhole nor erosion basin. Its sides appear cut by human hands, the soil unusually rich in ferric oxide, as if scorched long ago. Melton camped nearby for 3 nights. On the 4th morning, his tent was found empty, the bedroll flattened as if never used. His field notebook, discovered at the site, contained a single unfinished sentence. The sound returns when local authorities assumed a wild animal attack or accidental fall into one of the region's many shafts. But searchers reported something stranger. Every time they shouted his name, the echo returned before the sound had finished leaving their mouths, as if the hollow itself were answering. Around that same time, a retired clerk, now old and near blind, claimed to have heard scratching in his parlor wall. When he pried open the paneling, he found a slip of paper wedged between the boards, browned but dry. The writing matched the ledger's hand perfectly and bore the familiar line, "You have opened it again." The event was dismissed as hysteria. Yet newspapers in Springfield picked up the tale under the headline, "The Sheriff Writes Still." The article mocked rural superstition, but its circulation revived old memories. Visitors began coming from as far as St. Louis, hoping to see the haunted ground. For a brief period, the hollow became a curiosity, a site for amateur investigators, photographers, and thrill-seekers. One group claimed to have lowered a phonograph cylinder on a rope to record the silence. When they played it back, the wax bore faint scratches, forming a continuous rhythm. Those who listened closely described it as a slow turning of pages. Another said it resembled the cadence of a man's pen writing by lamplight. The recording, sent later to Columbia for analysis, reportedly shattered in transit without apparent cause. By 1903, the site was declared unsafe due to repeated cave-ins. The county sealed it under orders from the state, filling the depression with gravel and iron slag from nearby mines. A wooden marker was placed, reading simply, "Do not disturb." But the sealing brought no peace. That winter, tremors shook the nearby farms, small rhythmic quakes that locals swore sounded like tapping. Windows rattled in even intervals, as though something deep below still kept time. An elderly farmer named Lemuel Brackett, grandson of the vanished family, wrote to the county seat, "You can bury the hole, but you can't bury what listens through it." His letter was never answered. But when census takers came through the following spring, they found the Brackett farm abandoned, the hearth still warm, doors unbarred, and on the kitchen table, a notebook, blank but damp to the touch. By 1905, the hollow and the strange ledger had faded again into local legend, spoken of by the old, scoffed at by the young. But there remained, tucked away in the county courthouse's archives, a slim folder labeled Residual Case Harding. Inside lay what little survived: a partial map of Cedar Branch drawn by hand, a single burnt iron key, and several transcriptions of witness statements written decades apart. One of those statements came from Sheriff Thomas Ridley, recorded just before his death in 1904. The transcript, in a shaky but deliberate hand, reads, "It was not his hand that wrote last. I touched that page, and it was warm as flesh." The clerk who typed it noted in brackets, "Speaker agitated, sweating, pulse unsteady." Ridley's body was found the next morning in his bed, his hands blackened at the fingertips as though from ink or frostbite. The coroner ruled natural failure of the heart. Within months, his replacement, Sheriff Edwin Mallory, ordered the remaining evidence sealed indefinitely. But as Mallory signed the papers, witnesses in the office reported a faint scratching sound, like pen on parchment, emanating from the desk drawer. Mallory laughed it off, locked the folder, and quipped, "Let the old ghosts keep their minutes." That night, the courthouse clock stopped precisely at 12. When the janitor went to wind it in the morning, he found its brass pendulum covered in a thin film of black residue that smelled faintly of cedar oil. Around the same time, a traveling minister named Jonas Armitage passed through the area, preaching temperance in small towns along the White River. In his personal memoir, Roads and Revelations, Armitage devoted an entire chapter to his brief stay in Ozark County. They told me of a sheriff who vanished and a book that would not close. I thought it country nonsense until I slept near that creek. The earth bell, I was restless. I felt it shift as if sighing. I woke to the sound of pages turning, though my Bible lay shut beside me. He left before dawn, but not before writing one final line in his journal. The names are still being written. By 1907, a mining company attempted to purchase land near the hollow for a quarry site. The lead surveyor, Walter Hemphill, documented several failed attempts to break ground. The machinery stalled, and the drill heads snapped without striking stone. "It's as if the earth refused," he wrote in his log. He withdrew the team after 2 laborers claimed to have seen a lantern moving under the soil. The following year, the town built a new bridge over Cedar Branch. During construction, workers uncovered an object embedded in the bank, a strip of brass about a foot long, curved like a book spine. Stamped into it were the words, faint but legible, E. Harding, Sheriff, 1863. The foreman kept it for a day before surrendering it to the county clerk, who placed it in storage. When he returned the next morning, the brass piece had tarnished completely black, and the air around the cabinet smelled again of burnt cedar. By 1909, the courthouse staff refused to handle anything labeled Harding. It became an unspoken rule. Leave that file where it rests, and don't write its name after sunset. Even the archivists avoided copying it after dusk, fearing, though they'd never admit it, that the story might start writing them back. By 1910, Ozark County had entered a new century of industry and optimism. Electricity hummed faintly in a few homes, the railway cut through the ridges, and the old superstitions were said to be dying with the elders. Yet there was one matter the new generation refused to touch: the mound by Cedar Branch. It was that spring when a young journalist from Kansas City, Clara Baines, arrived to write what she called a rational account of rural myths. She was thorough, skeptical, and carried with her a Kodak camera, 2 spare lenses, and the confidence of modern science. Locals warned her politely not to camp near the hollow, but she insisted on doing so to debunk the foolishness firsthand. She stayed 3 nights. The first evening passed without incident. Her notes mention a stillness almost too complete and a faint mineral scent, like rusted keys in rainwater. On the second night, she recorded a series of knocks, measured, deliberate, and spaced evenly. She chalked it up to dripping water and wrote, "Fear is only repetition mistaken for intent." But her third entry, the last in her surviving notebook, is different. The handwriting falters mid-line. He is still writing. The sound is below the floor. When a search party followed her trail, they found her tent untouched, her camera tripod standing, and her boots neatly placed beside her cot. The camera's final photograph, underexposed but partially recovered decades later, shows what appears to be a faint light source underground, thin as a candle flame, beneath what looks like cedar roots. The case made headlines for a week. Reporter vanishes in Ozarks while investigating ghost tale. Theories abounded: wild animals, quicksand, madness. But her camera film, when analyzed in St. Louis, revealed something peculiar. On 2 frames, a blurred shape resembling handwriting could be faintly discerned across the soil. Lou, minus as though written with light itself. Not long after her disappearance, The county magistrate ordered the site fenced off once again. Yet every time the fence was raised, the posts sank overnight. After the third attempt, the workers refused to return. One claimed that the ground beneath wasn't firm. It pulsed like breath. A few months later, the brass spine of Harding's ledger, the one recovered from the 1888 courthouse fire, vanished from the archive. In its place lay a thin, unmarked page bearing new writing in ink too fresh to deny. She has joined the record. The archivist on duty, a man named Elliot Green, swore no one had entered the room. When questioned, he merely said, "The pen was already moving when I saw it." Afterward, Green resigned and left the state. In his only interview years later, he admitted, "I don't believe in spirits, but I know the sound of a quill when it's not held by a hand." It was the last documented incident tied directly to the Harding ledger before the courthouse was relocated in 1912, and all older files were placed in sealed storage beneath the new building. Yet during the move, several workers reported the faint scent of cedar rising from the crates, even though every box had been nailed shut. The new courthouse, built in 1912, stood proudly on the hill overlooking the town square, a monument to progress, law, and light. Its marble floors gleamed, its clock tower tolled with mechanical precision. No one mentioned the boxes carried from the old building, the ones sealed in tar and marked only with a faint red H. They were stored deep in the basement, where the air was always cool and the hum of the generator drowned other sounds. For a few years, all was quiet. The older clerks retired, and new faces filled the offices, young men and women who thought the old stories were little more than folklore from the unlettered frontier. Yet in 1915, a custodian named Albert Crane began reporting that he heard the typewriters going after hours. When he entered the records room, the machine sat silent. Still, every morning, the staff found blank sheets threaded and half-rolled, bearing faint horizontal impressions, like the ghost of typing that never used ink. Crane's supervisor dismissed it until one evening when both men stayed late. Around midnight, they heard it, a slow, rhythmic tapping coming from beneath the tiled floor. It wasn't metal against metal, but softer, closer to pen on paper. They pried up one tile and found only solid foundation beneath, though the sound ceased instantly, as if it knew it was being watched. That same month, the courthouse clock began losing time, precisely 6 minutes every night. The custodian noted that the lag matched the duration of the tapping they'd heard. Soon after, a legal clerk named Mrs. Ada Larkin filed an incident report claiming that when she went to retrieve files from the H section, she found her own name freshly written on a sheet that had not existed the day before. The handwriting was fine and formal, dated 1863. Next to her name, one word: listening. A judge dismissed it as hysteria, and the incident faded from official record. But among the staff, a quiet rule took hold. No one went into the archive room alone, and no one wrote after midnight. In 1916, a visiting historian, Dr. Horace Kilgore, arrived to research Civil War communications. He requested permission to examine the sealed boxes from the old courthouse. Reluctantly, the clerk obliged. Kilgore spent 3 days underground reviewing the ledgers. On the 4th morning, he was found slumped at the table, alive but incoherent, muttering about a sheriff who answers in ink. He lived another year but never spoke of his findings. His notes, preserved in the university archives, contain only one line repeated a dozen times. The journal is still keeping minutes. After Kilgore's collapse, the boxes were resealed under judicial order and encased in concrete. The workmen joked that the town had buried its ghosts for good. But on the day the last layer of cement dried, the courthouse clock struck 13, one bell too many, and every typewriter in the building rattled once, unbidden. A reporter later wrote that the courthouse shook faintly, as though the foundation had exhaled. The phenomenon was never explained. By the close of 1917, the war in Europe occupied every headline. No one spoke of Ozark mysteries anymore. Yet in a small ledger stored at the State Archive in Jefferson City, a clerk recorded a curious delivery. One envelope from Ozark County, containing a single blank page, still moist to the touch and smelling of cedar. Attached was a note in an unfamiliar hand, filed in accordance with ongoing record. No sender was listed. The letter reached Jefferson City on a gray morning in February 1918, its envelope unremarkable, postmarked from Ozark County, but with no return address. Archivist Henry Wells, who received it, assumed it to be a misfiled report from the courthouse. He opened it absently, expecting an inventory list. What he found instead was that faintly damp sheet, cool to the touch, with a texture unlike any paper he had handled. The scent of cedar was so strong it lingered for hours. He logged it as unclassified material, provenance unclear, and placed it in a cabinet under temporary storage. That evening, before leaving, Wells made a note in his ledger. The page seems to pulse faintly when handled, perhaps an illusion from the lamplight. He locked the room and went home. By morning, the cabinet was found ajar. The envelope lay empty. The janitor on duty, Samuel Dray, swore he heard someone writing quick and low behind the closed door at dawn. When he entered, the room was empty except for a single sheet on Wells's desk. Across it, in crisp black ink, appeared 6 words written in a 19th-century hand. "We are not yet all buried." Wells resigned the following week, taking leave to recover his nerves. His successor, a young clerk named Bert Harlan, dismissed the matter as a prank, until the building's telegraph operator reported strange interference whenever messages were sent southward toward the Ozarks. Each transmission ended with an extra line of text appearing in the return code, random letters that, when deciphered by a code clerk, spelled Harding. Throughout 1919, the same phenomenon continued. Wires clicked late at night, even when no operator was present. Some blamed static, others wartime equipment still lingering in surplus, but one technician, an old veteran of the Civil War, remarked quietly, "That name used to pass through field lines, too, carried like a whisper." Meanwhile, in Ozark County, reports surfaced once more of tremors near the old Cedar Branch site. Farmers described the ground vibrating at intervals, always at dusk, and a faint glow visible beneath the shallow creek. A child fishing nearby claimed to see letters floating in the water. When questioned, he drew them roughly in the dirt, looping script, old-fashioned, unmistakably cursive. County officials investigated and found nothing unusual, only that the gravel laid years earlier had begun to sink again, as if the earth below had hollowed itself out anew. The sheriff at the time, Benjamin Holt, ordered a barrier erected and the area declared unsafe. Yet he, too, was seen near the site several times after dark, lantern in hand, standing motionless as though listening for something below. A letter discovered among his belongings after his death in 1920 reads, "I have seen the ink move. It bleeds upward through the ground, not down. Elias was right. It remembers." That was the last official document to mention Sheriff Elias Harding by name for nearly 50 years. After Holt's death, the county sealed the hollow once more, this time beneath poured concrete and iron lattice. The townsfolk believed it finished at last. But still, every few decades, the ground there shifts. Travelers report hearing the quiet scrape of pen on parchment, steady and patient, somewhere beneath the soil. And those who dare to stand over that spot after midnight claim they can smell cedar and lamp oil, and, faintly, a voice reading names from a list that never ends. For half a century, the story of Sheriff Harding and his unholy ledger faded into silence, buried beneath new roads, concrete, and the steady hum of modern life. By the 1960s, the old courthouse had been renovated again, its basement repurposed for storage. Few remembered that the foundations themselves sat over the original cellars of the 19th century structure. In 1963, precisely 100 years after Harding's first journal entry, a junior archivist named Margaret Eves began cataloging forgotten county records for microfilm preservation. Among the dust-caked boxes marked for disposal, she found one with no label, its surface tacky with resin and faintly scented of cedar. Inside were dozens of loose pages, many blank, others faintly imprinted as if written on and later erased. Near the bottom lay a single envelope bearing the words, "For continuation." At first, Eves thought it a prank by the senior staff. Yet when she examined one of the blank sheets under angled light, she saw impressions, grooves that formed words, though no ink remained. She shaded over them with a pencil, revealing the phrase, "The record is never closed." She laughed it off and filed the box for later examination. That night, however, the microfilm machine began running on its own. The ribbon advanced, then stopped abruptly at frame 1863. When she developed the strip the next morning, she saw an image that should not have existed. A single handwritten line across the black film, luminous against the negative. It read, "You have opened it again." Her supervisor dismissed the incident, blaming faulty exposure, but Eves was unsettled enough to document it in her diary. 2 weeks later, she failed to report to work. Her apartment showed no sign of struggle, only that every page of her diary had been torn out except the last. On that page, one entry remained. "He is writing beneath us." The disappearance made only small news. Officials claimed she had left the state. Yet during the following months, courthouse staff noticed faint stains reappearing on old records, black smudges along the margins, oily to the touch, smelling of charred cedar. Maintenance crews scrubbed the walls, but the marks returned, always forming near the floor, spreading slowly upward, as if something were pushing through from below. When the county hired a contractor to renovate the basement in 1965, workers discovered a section of foundation hollowed out behind a false wall. Inside was a cavity just large enough to stand in, its interior walls scorched. At its center lay the rusted hinge of a book, fused shut, its spine faintly engraved with a single word, "Minutes." The hinge was taken to the state lab for analysis. The metallurgist's report noted an impossible composition, 19th century iron mixed with trace modern alloys. The surface, he wrote, appears to have been rewritten, layers of oxidation forming lines like script. Shortly after the report was filed, the lab suffered an unexplained power failure. The hinge was never recovered. To this day, employees in the courthouse speak of one peculiar sound that rises through the ventilation during quiet hours, a faint scraping rhythm, too deliberate to be machinery. Those who've stayed late describe it as writing that never quite finishes the word. And somewhere, perhaps between one ledger and the next, the record continues. By 1971, the courthouse stood modernized, fluorescent lights buzzing, file cabinets labeled, and clerks filing reports by the hour. Yet deep beneath, in the sub-basement few ever visited, the air remained heavy and damp. It was there that an electrician named Raymond Sutter began noticing problems with the new wiring. Fuses blew without cause, and the emergency lights flickered at precise intervals, always 3 seconds apart, as if following a pulse. One evening, while tracing the faulty circuit, Sutter pried open a panel behind the records vault. Inside, he found no wires, only a narrow recess descending into the concrete, black as soot. A draft of cold air rose from it. He leaned closer and heard something faint, the steady scrape of pen on paper. Thinking it a trick of the ventilation, he called out. The sound stopped. Then, unmistakably, a voice murmured back, "Record noted." Sutter fled and refused to return. His supervisor dismissed it as exhaustion, but 2 nights later, the circuit blew again. When a second crew came to repair it, they found Sutter's tools neatly arranged by the panel and a single sheet of paper on the floor, clean, unaged, and written in looping 19th-century cursive. Witness added, R. Sutter, electrician. After that, the vault was sealed permanently. The access panel was welded shut, and staff were instructed never to enter the lower maintenance level without 2 supervisors present. The county archivist, Mrs. Harlan, had the remaining records moved upstairs. Still, the power outages continued every few weeks, each time followed by faint tapping sounds through the floor vents, like slow applause. By then, the old story of Sheriff Harding had become a curiosity again. Local radio stations ran Halloween specials about the writing sheriff of the Ozarks, dramatizing his disappearance and the cursed ledger. Listeners dismissed it as folklore, but within days of the broadcast, the station received dozens of calls from residents near Cedar Branch claiming they'd heard scratching in their basements the night the episode aired. Some said they smelled cedar oil. Others swore they found damp footprints leading from their cellar doors to nowhere. A university folklorist, Dr. Martha Cleary, visited in 1972 to document the phenomenon. She interviewed townspeople, examined surviving transcripts, and even located the site of the old hollow, now covered by a service road. In her field notes she wrote, "The asphalt buckles irregularly, as if something beneath shifts after rain. A hollow vibration persists when one speaks the sheriff's name aloud." During her final visit, she brought a portable recorder. The audio survives, though damaged by age. In it, Dr. Cleary can be heard reading aloud from a transcript of Harding's final entry. "The soil is full of memory. We only borrowed its silence." Moments later, there's a low rumble, then faint rhythmic scraping, pen against paper, slow and methodical. Her last words before the tape cuts out. "It's still writing." Dr. Cleary never returned to the university. Her car was found parked near the old service road, keys still in the ignition, trunk half open. Inside was a cedar branch wrapped in brown paper, marked in pencil. Sample, active. The branch was dry to the touch, but the paper around it was damp, smudged with black streaks that bled like ink. The tape was donated anonymously to the State Historical Archive years later. It arrived in an unmarked envelope, postmarked from the Ozarks, containing only the reel and a handwritten note. For continuation, the 1970s in the Ozarks were years of quiet decline, mills shutting down, young people leaving, and old tales settling like dust. Yet the story of the Harding ledger persisted, whispered at diners and in church basements, a superstition passed between generations who had never seen the hollow, but still avoided its ground. In 1975, a regional historian named Dr. Thomas Acker began a funded project titled Folklore of the Civil War South. Among his notes was a reference to an unverified account of a sheriff's journal in Ozark County linked to disappearances between 1863 and 1910. The story intrigued him precisely because it resisted proof. He sought to trace every physical remnant, the courthouse foundation, the archived pages, even the descendants of the Brackett family. Acker arrived in late September and rented a cabin near the old Cedar Branch Road. He described the air as peculiarly still, without echo. Locals told him to avoid the area after dark, and though amused, he noted their fear with anthropological precision. On his third night, he recorded in his field diary, "The ground hums faintly beneath the grass, possible water flow, though the rhythm feels deliberate." His final entry, written 2 days later, reads only, "They're keeping records still." The next morning, a farmer found his notebook on the road, damp but intact, every page blank except the last. Dr. Acker himself was never located. The disappearance stirred media attention again. Reporters from St. Louis and Chicago descended on Ozark County, publishing features under headlines like "The Ledger That Wouldn't Die." But when photographers visited the courthouse basement, they discovered something uncanny. The old cemented section, where the boxes had been sealed in 1916, had cracked. A single narrow seam ran from floor to ceiling, and from that seam seeped a thin line of black moisture, glistening, like ink. Samples sent to the state lab tested negative for any known pigment or mineral compound. The report classified it as organic, though no cellular structure could be identified. One technician remarked, "It stains like ink but burns like oil." County officials ordered the wall resealed and refused further comment. Still, at night, janitors reported a faint scratching sound from behind the new plaster, soft, rhythmic, never frantic. The courthouse staff began leaving the lower lights burning through the night. By 1978, the legend had turned into a local cautionary tale. Children dared each other to whisper the sheriff's name at the courthouse steps. Most laughed, but a few swore that if you spoke Elias Harding after midnight, you could hear an echo, not repeating you, but writing you down. That autumn, a small earthquake rattled the region, minor, but enough to crack the asphalt over the old Cedar Branch Road. A truck driver who stopped to inspect the damage found a depression in the center of the buckled pavement, about the size of a man's torso. Beneath it, the soil was soft, dark, and faintly warm. He called the highway department. By the time they arrived, the hole had filled itself in. That winter, the truck driver mailed a postcard to the county clerk's office. On it, in shaky handwriting, he'd written only 6 words. I heard him signing the page. It was dated December 28, 1978, exactly 115 years after Sheriff Harding first wrote his name in the ledger. By 1983, Cedar Branch was nothing more than a crooked scar of old road swallowed by forest. The county stopped maintaining it, and maps labeled it "Access Closed." Yet stories have a way of resurfacing when forgotten too long. That spring, a group of university students from Fayetteville visited the region to record local folklore for a course project. Their professor, Dr. Leonard Pruitt, encouraged them to interview residents about the Sheriff's Journal legend. Most laughed politely, some refused to speak at all, and one elderly woman, Ethel Crow, said simply, "You'll hear him if you write too close." Taking this as a challenge, the students brought a tape recorder, camping lanterns, and notebooks to the overgrown stretch of Cedar Branch Road. Their field report, later recovered, documents every hour until midnight. Then the writing stops. The final entry, time-stamped 12:03 a.m., reads, "There's tapping under the asphalt, counting 3, pausing, then 3 again. It's like someone's knocking from below." By morning, the group's car was found abandoned at the roadside. The tent, lanterns, and recording equipment remained, but the tape had been erased entirely, except for the faint sound of turning pages, steady as breath. Only one student, Anna Whitmore, was found wandering the forest hours later in shock. When asked what happened, she replied, "He finished the line." She never explained further. The incident drew limited attention, labeled as youthful misadventure, but among archivists and historians familiar with the Harding case, it reopened old questions. The sheriff's name appeared once again in internal correspondence, cross-referenced with "missing persons, Cedar Branch vicinity." One official scribbled in the margin of his report, Stop filing under his name. He files back. That same year, the courthouse underwent another renovation, installing modern H, eating ducts through the sub-basement. The workers complained that one corner, directly beneath the old archive, produced a metallic scratching whenever drills hit the wall. One foreman recorded it on a handheld cassette, a repeating rhythm, faintly echoing the cadence of handwriting. Engineers analyzed the tape and concluded it was interference from the equipment. Yet when the recording was played at normal speed, the scratches formed a distinct pattern: 3 long strokes, pause, 3 short. Morse operators later identified the sequence as spelling EH, the initials of Elias Harding. The tape was placed in storage, but never catalogued. By the time the county's Historical Society requested it for exhibit in 1985, the box was empty, its label peeled away, the adhesive residue smelling faintly of cedar and lamp oil. That same winter, a janitor cleaning the courthouse after hours noticed a small pool of dark liquid spreading across the basement floor. It was thick, slow-moving, and shaped, by accident or not, like an open book. He mopped it up, threw away the rag, and went home. When he returned the next morning, the same puddle had reappeared, exactly in the same shape, but this time it was dry, absorbed into the concrete as if drawn downward. He swore later that when he leaned down to inspect it, he heard someone murmuring faintly under the floorboards, reading names in an even, calm voice. He could make out only one clearly before the sound faded. Raymond Sutter, the same electrician lost a decade earlier. After that night, the janitor refused to work below ground. He said he'd realized what the stories never dared to say aloud, that the ledger had never been a book at all. It was a place, and the ground itself, patient and tireless, was still keeping its minutes. By 1990, Ozark County had grown quiet again. The interstate bypassed the old roads, and the courthouse stood alone at the edge of a town no one stopped in. Few remembered the sheriff's name, except as a local ghost story told in bars on stormy nights. Yet for those who worked in the archives, the past was never truly silent. A new county historian, Eleanor Hayes, arrived that year to digitize the remaining records. She was pragmatic, organized, and had little patience for superstition. When asked if she'd heard the stories, she smiled and said, "If a ghost wants to file paperwork, I'll give him a form." Her first months passed uneventfully. Then one evening, while scanning early property deeds, she noticed an anomaly. A folder dated 1863, filed under the wrong drawer. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, unusually thick, bearing faint indentations. Under ultraviolet light, the impressions became visible, lines of text in looping cursive, identical to Harding's known hand. The words read, "Continuation acknowledged. Clerk noted." She dismissed it as an archival forgery, but her curiosity got the better of her. After hours, she returned with an audio recorder, hoping to capture the faint creaks and noises rumored to haunt the basement. At exactly 12:06 a.m., the tape caught a rhythmic sound, not pipes, not machinery, like a quill dragged slowly across rough paper. Then a man's voice, low and calm, saying only, "Present." Hayes never released the tape publicly, but her field log survives. The last entry reads, "It's not a haunting, it's maintenance." 2 weeks later, during a storm, the courthouse lost power. When the staff returned the next morning, they found the archive doors open, though the locks were intact. Every file drawer stood pulled halfway out, and the papers within, thousands of them, had been rearranged alphabetically by hand. Atop the desk sat one folder, labeled in red pencil, "Harding, Elias, Sheriff." Inside was a blank page, slightly damp, smelling faintly of cedar. Hayes vanished the following month, Her car was found beside the service road near Cedar Branch, tires half sunk in mud. In the passenger seat lay her recorder. The tape inside was blank except for the first few seconds, a faint scratching, then a soft sigh, followed by a man's voice. All present and accounted for. After her disappearance, county officials sealed the sub-basement again and declared it restricted. Maintenance crews poured a new layer of concrete, yet months later, hairline cracks appeared, forming a pattern of looping lines that, when traced, resembled handwriting. The pattern began near the east wall and ended beneath the foundation where the old archive once stood. To this day, no one dares to enter that level alone. The janitors refuse shifts after dark. Visitors claim they can still smell oil lamps when the humidity rises, and sometimes, if you listen closely, the sound of writing drifts faintly through the vents, measured, careful, and utterly patient. Locals say that's the sheriff keeping order in his own way, recording every soul who disturbs his quiet. Others believe the ledger never stopped because it was never meant to. That it wasn't just Harding who wrote in 1863, but something beneath him that finally learned to write back. The new millennium came quietly to the Ozarks. Asphalt cracked, cedar reclaimed the ridges, and the courthouse's modern glass annex cast its reflection across ground that had never known peace. By 2013, even the last residents who remembered the old stories were gone, their children certain the legend of Sheriff Elias Harding was a rural myth. Yet the land kept its own record, and every few years something small would rise, a fragment, a sound, a scent, to remind those who lingered that memory in these hills runs deep. That spring, during foundation work for an elevator expansion, contractors broke through a section of the sub-basement wall. Behind it lay an air pocket filled with stale, cold air and something else, a faint rustle, like dry paper. They called the site manager, who found inside a cavity not much larger than a closet, its floors smooth and sunken, and across that surface a thin layer of residue dark as ink. The lead worker, Jim Harcourt, snapped a photograph for the county report. The image showed faint impressions in the residue, rows of curved lines and dots that resembled handwriting, but no one could decipher them. Harcourt said the air smelled like cedar and rain after lightning. They resealed the wall the same day. That night, motion sensors in the basement triggered twice, both times between midnight and 12:10 a.m. Security footage captured nothing but faint distortion across the frame, followed by what technicians later called localized shadow movement. The following morning, every file on the courthouse's digital archive, nearly 12,000 entries, showed a new metadata tag, appended automatically. Recorded, 1863, present. No one could explain how or why the tag appeared. The IT department scrubbed the servers, but the line reappeared every time the system rebooted. Finally, an administrator added a manual note to the database. Anomaly acknowledged. Proceeding as written. 3 weeks later, a night custodian left a voicemail for his supervisor before quitting mid-shift. "I heard someone talking down there. Thought it was a radio, but it wasn't. He was just reading names, real quiet-like. Said mine, too, real calm. Then it stopped, like he was waiting for me to answer." He never returned to collect his pay. Today, the courthouse basement is permanently sealed. Concrete poured over the old foundations still settles unevenly, cracking in slow, curling lines every few years. During renovations, engineers say they sometimes hear faint knocks from below, 3 slow, 3 fast, repeating like heartbeat and breath combined. Visitors who walk near the eastern wall notice the air grow cooler and a subtle smell of cedar and oil, as if an unseen lantern had just been lit. Some say that, late at night, when the power hums low, a whisper rises through the vents, a patient voice reciting a roll call of names stretching back more than a century. No one knows how long the list is or when it ends, only that the writing never truly stopped, and that every sound made, every footstep taken, is quietly, dutifully entered somewhere beneath the Ozark ground. The ledger remains open, and the sheriff, it seems, is still keeping watch.